Judges Corner is brought to you by CoolStuffInc.com and gatheringmagic.com. Support our show by visiting both websites. Now it's time for Judges Corner with David Green.
Welcome back to Judges Corner. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about summoning sickness. So, what is summoning sickness? It's kind of an informal way of explaining a very formal rule in Magic, which states that creatures can't attack or use their tap abilities with the tap symbol or their untap abilities with the untap symbol unless you've controlled them since the beginning of your turn. For example, if I play an Avacyn's Pilgrim, I can't attack with it or tap it for mana if I just played it this turn. If a creature enters play and leaves play and comes right back into play, it's sick again. If a creature comes into play during the upkeep, it can't attack or use its abilities because that's actually not soon enough. So, speaking of soon enough, when can I use these abilities? When exactly is the beginning of the turn? Well, the beginning of the turn is during your untap step. If you've untapped and you've controlled the creatures when you went to go and untap, then they're good to go. They're not sick, they can attack. If you gain control of them or they came into play or something happened where you didn't control them and they weren't in play, then they can't attack, they're still summoning sick. So obviously with every rule, there's usually a way around a rule, and in this example we have one called Haste. Haste lets us attack, tap, or get around summoning sickness and just completely ignore summoning sickness as long as the creatures have haste. If they lose haste, they're obviously subject to summoning sickness. There's another way around it, which would be if a creature actually says, tap this creature, or tap some creatures, effect. That's a way around it because it doesn't actually have the tap symbol. So it's a lot of words, a little confusing. Let's take a look at some examples and see exactly what I mean. We have a Skur's Dag, High Priest, and 2 Doomed Travelers on the battlefield, and our opponent plays Bonfire of the Damned for X = 1, destroying the 2 travelers, producing 2 spirits. When this happens, we now have Morbid online, and we can now produce a 5/5 demon with our High Priest. This is because the 2 tokens, even though they're sick, can be tapped with the High Priest because the High Priest is not tapping them through a tap ability on the 2 cards, but rather tapping them through its own cost, saying to tap 2 creatures. And when this happens, we'll get a 5/5 demon. In our next example, we have a Burning Tree Emissary being played, and then off of that, a Lightning Mauler. When the Lightning Mauler comes into play, we're going to pair the 2 together, and they'll both get haste. Because of this, we can attack with them now if we want to. But let's say we do that, we pair them, and just before we attack with them, our opponent kills off the Lightning Mauler. When this happens, our Emissary no longer has haste, but it just came into play this turn, and because of that, it's now subject to summoning sickness once again. So I mentioned before that if I gain control of a creature, it has summoning sickness. And what I mean by that is if I take your creature, but it was able to attack before, when I gain control of it, I haven't controlled it since the beginning of my last turn, so I can't attack with it. Usually effects that do this, like Act of Treason, actually give it haste, so I can attack with it or use its abilities right away. But some effects don't. So let's look at an example of that and go from there. We have a Simic Manipulator with 2 +1/+1 counters. We tap it and remove the counters in order to take control of our opponent's Huntmaster of the Fells. When this happens, first off, we don't get 2 life or a wolf token because it didn't enter the battlefield. We just gain control of it from the battlefield. Second, it can't attack because it's summoning sick, and it's summoning sick because we haven't controlled it since the beginning of our turn. So another thing worth mentioning would be that everything is subject to summoning sickness, but only creatures are affected by it. And what I mean by that is enchantments, artifacts, planeswalkers, and lands, if they become creatures, can't attack or tap for mana or to attack for turn. And a good example of that would be if I play a Key Rune and I want to tap to add mana to my pool, that's perfectly fine. But if I play a Key Rune and I turn it into a creature, I can no longer attack with it or tap to add mana from it. This is because it's now summoning sick. Of course, if I've controlled that Key Rune since the beginning of my last turn or since the beginning of my turn, then of course it can attack or tap for mana even if it is a creature. So let's take a look at another example of this. In this example, we have a Scarred Guildmage and 3 untapped lands. We play a 4th land for turn and activate the Guildmage's second ability, turning one of our lands into a 4/4 creature. If we select the land we just played, unfortunately, we won't be able to attack with it or even tap it for mana because it's summoning sick now that it's a creature. But if we select one of the other lands, we can actually attack with it or even tap to add mana to our mana pool. And that other land we played can still be tapped for mana as long as it's not a creature. So the last thing I want to reiterate is if a creature leaves play and comes right back into play right away or later in the turn, it becomes sick again. And a good example of that would be if I play a Restoration Angel and blink a creature, when the creature comes back into play, it's going to be sick again. The last thing I saved is the best, and that's phasing. So exactly how does phasing work? When does a creature with phasing come back into play if it's phased out? A creature with phasing phases back into play during the beginning of the untap step. When this happens, even though you technically didn't control it while it was phased out, and it technically wasn't in play while it was phased out, it still was on the battlefield, and it still was under your control. In fact, when it comes phased back in, it just immediately continues being under your control as if it had never left it, and it continues being on the battlefield as if it had never left the battlefield. It doesn't trigger any effects that would trigger when a creature enters the battlefield because it's not entering the battlefield. It's just continuing to exist on the battlefield at this point in time. So because of that, you have controlled it since the beginning of your last turn, which is this turn, and you can attack with it or tap and use its tap abilities right away. So this concludes everything on Summoning Sickness. If you have any questions, send us your comments or questions to judgescorner@gatheringmagic.com or leave a comment below. And until next time, make sure to drink lots of water, get lots of rest, and have fun.